The grit of the desert wind, an old familiar rasp, found purchase in the frayed seams of my jacket. It tasted of dust and forgotten things, a flavor I had grown accustomed to since the city decided I was no longer fit for its polished corridors. Now my days unwound in the quiet, punctuated only by the clinking of cheap glass and the spectral whispers of a case that had carved a canyon through my life. I was a ghost haunting my own demise, a discarded lens peering at a world that had moved on. Then the static crackle from the radio in the corner of my cluttered room had sliced through the morning's muted hum. A voice, clipped and urgent, spoke of a breach, a vault emptied miles out beyond the city's sprawl. It was the kind of news that usually drifted past me, another ripple in a murky pond I no longer fished. But then came the details, sparse at first, then coalescing into a shape that made the air in my lungs grow heavy, cold. The method. A precision, a surgical strike that left no forced entry, no broken glass, only an absence where something valuable had been. And the exit, untraceable, vanishing into the vast, indifferent expanse. It wasn't just a heist. It was a phantom limb twitching, a scar beginning to ache with a phantom pain. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth curve of a whiskey tumbler, now craved the rough grip of a flashlight. My eyes, dulled by resignation, sharpened with an unwelcome, terrifying clarity. I drove, the old pickup rattling like a bag of bones, west, towards the rising sun that bleached the sky to a pale, unblinking eye. The landscape unspooled into an endless canvas of ochre and rust, punctuated by sparse, stubborn scrub brush. Each mile peeled back a layer of my self-imposed exile, revealing the raw nerve beneath. I told myself it was morbid curiosity, a detached observer drawn to the scene of a familiar tragedy. But deep down, where the old hunger still coiled, I knew it was more. The approach to the tunnel entrance, desert side, was a tableau of organized chaos. Emergency vehicles, their lights a silent, strobing ballet against the stark backdrop, painted the sand in fleeting hues of red and blue. Uniformed figures moved with a practiced urgency, their movements sharp against the blurring heat haze. A cordon of yellow tape, stark against the muted earth, fluttered like a warning flag. My chest tightened, a familiar constriction. This was where the last one had ended for me. This was where I had failed. I parked the pickup well back, amongst a scattering of other civilian vehicles, curious onlookers, mostly drawn by the spectacle. They stood at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of awe and grim fascination. I moved with a deliberate slowness, my gaze sweeping the scene, not for the obvious but for the subtle discord, the misplaced note in the symphony of the aftermath. The tunnel entrance itself was a gaping maw, bored into the side of a low mesa, its concrete rim cracked and weathered. It looked less like an access point and more like a wound. Around it, the sand was trampled, churned by boots and tires, but even from a distance, I could discern a pattern in the disturbance, or rather, a lack of one that screamed louder than any alarm. No deep gouges from hurried escapes, no scattered debris from a struggle, only the crisp, almost artful tracks of the investigators. A uniform younger than me, with eyes still holding the bright, unblemished light of conviction, spotted me loitering near the perimeter. "Can't go any closer, sir," he stated, his voice firm but polite. I gave him a nod, my gaze still fixed on the tunnel. "Just passing through. Saw the lights." My voice felt rusty, unused to the pretense of casual conversation. "Big one, huh?" He shifted his weight, glancing back at the scene. "They hit the depository clean like ghosts." He paused, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "No one saw anything, no alarms tripped. It's unsettling. Unsettling." The word was a dull echo of my own thoughts. I moved slowly along the tape, feigning a casual stroll, my eyes dissecting the ground. The desert floor was a canvas of fine, wind-blown sand, ideal for retaining impressions. And there it was, near a patch of brittle greasewood just beyond the official search radius, where a casual eye would dismiss it as a random mark. A faint, almost imperceptible indentation in the sand. Not a boot print, not a tire track. It was a shallow, perfectly circular depression, no bigger than a silver dollar, pressed into the earth with an almost delicate force. It looked like the mark left by a small, precisely weighted dowel. My breath hitched. No, it couldn't be, not again. This was the signature, the calling card of the one who had slipped through my fingers, the ghost who had dismantled my career, my life. He had always left a single, innocuous mark, a pinprick of perfection amidst the chaos of his crimes. A silent, arrogant testament to his presence, always just outside the main evidentiary perimeter. A lead investigator, a burly man whose face was a roadmap of stress and too many sleepless nights, barked orders into a radio, his voice a low rumble. He caught my eye, a frown etching deeper lines into his brow. "Cole, what in hell are you doing here?" His tone was not unfriendly, but laced with a clear warning. He knew my history. Everyone in the force did. Just felt a pull. I mumbled, my eyes still fixed on the faint circle in the sand. Heard about the method. The method, he scoffed, running a hand over his thinning hair. It's a vanishing act, Cole. No method we can trace, just, he shook his head. Clean, as if they had a key. And the exit? Vanished into the desert, like I said, no tracks leading away from the tunnel once they were out, just nothing. He paused, his gaze hardening. Look, Cole, I know what I were thinking, but that was years ago. This is just a professional crew. Professional, yes. I agreed, my eyes still scanning, searching for any other ghost. But the precision, the way they slip in and out without a trace. I was seeing sunlight glinting off a polished blade. The circular impression in the sand pulsed, a tiny, silent scream. It wasn't just a mark, it was a taunt. This wasn't a copycat. This was the original. The craftsman had returned. And the desert wind, which had once seemed to mock my failure, now felt like a desperate, accelerating current, pulling me back into the vortex. My hands clenched, the dust of my quiet life falling away like so much useless chaff. The determination, long dormant, flared hot and sharp. I had let him slip once. I wouldn't do it again. The desert wind, a parched breath, tugged at the collar of my worn jacket, trying to pull me away from the precipice of my own past. But I stood firm, rooted by the sight before me. The circular impression in the sand, a perfect, unnerving "oh" seemed to hum with a silent frequency only I could hear. It wasn't just a mark. It was a memory etched onto the gritty canvas of the earth, a glyph from a language I'd spent years trying to forget. My gaze drifted from the sand to the yawning maw of the tunnel entrance, desert side. The concrete lip, cracked and sunbaked, offered no solace, just shadows within shadows. The air inside would be cool, still, a stark contrast to the relentless heat outside. A perfect place for a beginning or an end. A shiver, not of cold but of recognition, traced its way down my spine, but the mark remained undeniable. I knelt, my knees protesting the sudden movement, and ran a gloved finger along the raised edge of the imprint. Not a boot, not a tool for digging. This was an impression left by something precise, something designed to form, not to destroy. It felt like the base of a small, heavy stamp, perhaps, or a miniature press, a tool of the craft. My mind, a battlefield of old ghosts, immediately conjured images. The intricate, almost delicate patterns found at the previous scenes years ago, not crude, haphazard violence, but a meticulous, almost artistic destruction. The same precision, the same unsettling signature. My gut twisted. This wasn't some random act of trespass. This was a deliberate message, carved into the very earth I stood upon. A personal summons. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. The heavy, measured tread of authority. I rose slowly, brushing sand from my trousers, affecting an air of casual observation. "Cole, what in blazes are you doing out here?" The voice was gruff, familiar. It belonged to a seasoned officer, his uniform crisp despite the dust. His eyes, narrowed against the sun, held a mixture of suspicion and a flicker of something that might have been pity. "Just taking a drive," I offered, my voice rougher than I intended. Saw the tape. Curiosity got the better of me. A flimsy excuse even to my own ears. The officer grunted, unimpressed. "Curiosity or something else. This isn't your jurisdiction anymore, Cole. Hasn't been for a long time." He gestured vaguely at the tunnel entrance. "Just some kids, looks like, tried to get into the old service tunnels, left a mess. Nothing for you to worry about." "A mess?" I asked, my gaze returning to the precise circular impression. "Looks pretty deliberate to me." He followed my gaze, then scoffed. "Some kind of spray paint can maybe, or a bottle. Kids these days." He wasn't entirely wrong. I had seen a ghost, or at least its calling card. "Just the desert heat playing tricks," I lied smoothly. "Thought I recognized some of the graffiti from a few years back, the artist who used to tag the old water towers." It was a deliberate misdirection, a plausible cover for my intense interest, hoping it would satisfy his casual inquiry. He shrugged, clearly wanting me gone but lacking a formal reason to remove me. "Yeah, well, we'll get it cleaned up. I should head back. Nothing to see here. Nothing to see here." The words echoed the dismissive reports from my past, the ones that had led me down a rabbit hole of obsession. They were wrong then, and they were wrong now. My eyes scanned the ground, not for graffiti, but for the subtle disturbances the uniformed eye might overlook. Near the edge of the circular imprint, almost imperceptible against the wind-rippled sand, was a faint dusting of what looked like powdered clay, a fine ochre residue. Not natural to this pale, grayish sand. It clung to a few stray pebbles like a faint blush. This detail, so small, was a jolt. Clay. The previous killer, the one who had shattered my career and haunted my nights, had an unsettling predilection for objects molded from clay, intricately shaped and left at the seams. He wasn't just a killer, he was a craftsman leaving behind his morbid art. The crafts I'd failed to understand fully. They just left a mess, huh? I mused aloud, more to myself than to the officer. No forced entry, no obvious signs of struggle, just a mark and some dust. The officer was already turning away, his radio crackling to life. Just Cole, before I have to write I up for loitering. I nodded a silent promise. I would go, but not far, and certainly not home. My mind was already racing, piecing together fragments, the circular impression, the powdered clay, the crafts. It wasn't just a copycat, it was too precise, too specific. This was the same hand, years later, picking up where it left off. He was back. As I walked away, my boots scuffing the sand, I felt a familiar determination calcify within me. I had failed once, letting him slip through my fingers, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and broken lives, but not again. This wasn't just about solving a crime. This was about redemption, about silencing the ghosts that screamed in my quiet moments. The officer might call it loitering. I called it a reckoning. I had to know what was in that tunnel, what twisted creation had been left behind, and what it meant. The official investigation would follow its rigid protocols. I needed to see the larger picture, the pattern that only I seemed to recognize. And I knew exactly where to start looking for the next piece of this macabre puzzle. Not in reports or official statements, but in the forgotten corners, the places where the craft might be honed, where the clay might be shaped. The hunt had begun. And this time, I wouldn't stop until I looked into the eyes of the ghost I'd chased for so long. The desert wind, a tireless sculptor, whispered against the rusted frame of my pickup. I drove not towards any destination marked on a map, but guided by the magnetic north of an old obsession. The fragments from the first two scenes, the powdered clay, the circular imprint, the chilling familiarity of the crafts left behind, had coalesced into a cold certainty. This wasn't a copy. This was the original hand, stirring from a long slumber, its touch as precise and unsettling as a spider spinning a fresh web. My destination was vague, a ghost in my memory, the last known property connected to the original string of horrors. An abandoned factory miles beyond the city's sprawl, where the wind sang through broken panes like a forgotten choir. I needed to see it again, to breathe that air, to scour for any detail I might have missed in my younger, more frantic days. The sun was a bruised peach bleeding into the horizon when my radio crackled, pulling me from my reverie. A dispatch, terse and urgent. Priority 1. Breach at the secure storage facility, Sector Gamma, all units respond. Sector Gamma, my stomach clenched. That facility, a fortified bunker carved into the mesa, was rumored to house more than just gold ingots. I veered sharply, dust blooming behind me like a sepia cloud. The factory could wait. This felt different, bolder. The first two were tests, perhaps, or a reacquaintance with the craft. This was the main event. When I arrived, the scene was already a whirlwind of flashing lights and barked orders. Uniformed officers cordoned off a wide perimeter, their figures silhouetted against the stark desert landscape. My eyes, honed by years of sifting through chaos, immediately sought the focal point. It wasn't the main gate, which stood unmolested, nor the reinforced vault doors of the facility itself. My gaze was drawn to a jagged tear in the earth, a crude but effective breach near the base of a rocky outcrop. And there, stark against the pale ancient stone, was the tunnel entrance, desert side, a new scar on the land, clearly excavated with speed and brutal efficiency. I moved, a phantom on the periphery, skirting the edges of the official commotion. The air hummed with an ozone tang, the lingering scent of shaped charges. My eyes scanned the ground, searching for the familiar. And there it was, near a scattered pile of excavated rock, a faint, circular impression in the dust. My breath hitched. The powdered clay, too, a fine film clinging to the rough edges of a discarded piece of mining equipment. And then nestled almost deliberately beside a cracked slab of shale, a small, intricate carving of a bird, its wings outstretched in a perpetual, silent flight. A craft, the same hand, the same signature, but this one felt different, more confident. A challenge, a voice sharp and unwelcome cut through the din. "Cole, what the hell are I doing here?" I turned slowly. It was the detective, his face a mask of weary suspicion, his eyes narrowed slits in the harsh, artificial light, curiosity. He snorted, a sound devoid of humor. "Your curiosity has a way of leading you to trouble, and trouble has a way of following you." He gestured vaguely at the scene. They hit the secure vault, managed to bypass the internal systems. Clean, too clean. "What was taken?" I asked, my gaze still fixed on the tunnel entrance. "Official channels are still compiling a list. Early reports indicate specialized components, high-grade industrial diamonds, precision optics, things that don't just disappear into the black market for quick cash." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about this, would you? Given your history with this kind of artistry." I met his gaze unflinching. My history is ancient history, retired. He still blamed me, they all did. "Funny how ancient history keeps repeating itself when I rear around," he retorted, his eyes flicking from me to the tunnel, then back. "This is big, coal, bigger than the last two. They didn't just take the components, they left a mess. A deliberate show of force. The damage to the tunnel entrance, the scattered debris. It screams overkill." "Overkill?" I murmured, my eyes straying back to the perfectly formed bird carving. It didn't scream overkill, it screamed precision, a message. The deliberate destruction outside, the scattered rock, the damaged equipment. It felt like a staged chaos, a misdirection. "Yeah, overkill," the detective insisted, misinterpreting my thought. Like they wanted to make damn sure everyone knew they were here and they could do whatever they wanted. But that didn't add up. The crafts were about quiet artistry, meticulous detail. The circular impression in powdered clay suggested a specific tool, a precise method of entry, not a brute force explosion. If they wanted to make a show, why bother with such subtle signatures? Why the staged mess, outside, when the internal breach was clean? It felt like a magician's trick, drawing the eye to one hand while the other performed the real work. There was my desperate need to connect these new crimes to my old failure warping my perception. The detective's words echoed in my mind, a bitter refrain. Trouble has a way of following eye. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a magnet for the macabre, seeing patterns where there were only random acts of violence. But then I looked at the small, carved bird again, its wings frozen in that eternal ascent. It was too specific, too deliberate. This wasn't overkill. This was a narrative, and I was being drawn into its next chapter whether I wanted to be or not. My demons, it seemed, had decided to join the chase, and the detective, a grim reaper in uniform, was already watching my every step. The powdered clay, a ghost's whisper on the polished floorboards, had unsettled me more than the shattered vault. A show of force, yes, but beneath it, a meticulous hand. The circular impression, a perfect, unmarred ring, spoke of something precise, almost ritualistic amidst the manufactured chaos. It was a signature I remembered, a whisper from a past I had tried to bury under layers of whiskey and regret. My mind, a restless tide, pulled at loose threads. The old case, the one that had stripped me bare, had its own subtle markings, its own quiet artistry beneath the spectacle. A specific type of red earth, a unique geological dust found at each scene. I remembered tracing its origin on a faded map to the arid edge of the city where the scrubland met the forgotten mining veins. A hunch, a desperate clawing at memory, pushed me towards the periphery. The sun was a molten coin in the sky as I drove, the city's sprawl shrinking in my rearview mirror, replaced by the relentless ochre expanse. The air shimmered, heat rising in waves from the cracked asphalt. My destination, a place I hadn't thought of in years, pulled at me like a phantom limb. The old files, those brittle pages I'd committed to memory, held a faint mention of a discarded access point, a place where the earth had been scarred by forgotten ambitions. I found it eventually, a jagged mouth carved into the sandstone cliffs, the tunnel entrance desert side. The wind, a dry, rasping breath, whipped dust into my eyes as I stepped from the truck. The landscape here was a study in harsh beauty, ancient and unforgiving. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing across rough-hewn walls, illuminating the scars of old drills. The ground was uneven, a mix of loose rock and fine, powdery silt. And then I saw it. Not a grand revelation, but a series of almost invisible disturbances. Faint, circular depressions in the dust, barely discernible, leading deeper into the tunnel. They were not the clear, sharp ring from the heist scene, but rather the impression left by something similar, worn down perhaps or used repeatedly. And clinging to the edges of these marks, a fine, reddish dust. Not the exact powdered clay from the vault, but a close cousin, a geological relative indigenous to this specific desert soil. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a deliberate echo. I knelt, brushing away a layer of fine sand, and uncovered something else. A small, flattened piece of metal, dull and tarnished. It looked like a fragment from a specialized drill bit, one designed for precision boring through rock. The kind of tool that would leave a clean, circular impression. The initial heists, I dismissed them as opportunism, a series of high-value targets, a bank, a private art collection, a secure data repository. But now, with the dust of this forgotten tunnel on my fingers, a different kind of pattern began to coalesce in my mind. The bank wasn't just a bank. It was the vault where the city's oldest land deeds were stored, documents stretching back to its founding. The art collection, not just canvases, but a specific series of portraits depicting the city's founding families, men who had carved their fortunes from this very desert. And the data repository, it held records of old mining claims, water rights, and historical land disputes. It wasn't about the money or the objects themselves. It was about ownership, about history, about the very foundations of this city. My mind raced, pulling at threads of the past case, the one that had broken me. The victims then had been disparate, seemingly unconnected. A retired judge, a renowned historian, a wealthy developer. But each in their own way had held a key to the city's narrative, to its hidden truths. They hadn't been robbed of possessions. They had been robbed of information, of legacy. The new targets, these recent heists, mirrored that subtle, underlying motive. They weren't just stealing valuables, they were dismantling a story piece by piece. A narrative connected to the very ground beneath my feet, to the resources drawn from this parched earth, to the deals struck in the shadow of these very hills. Could it be? Could the architect of my past failure, the phantom who had slipped through my grasp, be back? I stood, my gaze sweeping across the desolate expanse of the tunnel entrance, desert side. The old case had been about a killer obsessed with history, with righting perceived wrongs, not with simple greed. My breath caught. I remembered a detail from the old files, a small, almost insignificant note from a forensic sketch artist. A recurring symbol, barely visible, etched into a piece of wood at one of the crime scenes. A stylized compass rose with one cardinal point conspicuously absent. I dismissed it as an artistic flourish then, a random detail. But now, standing here in the heart of this ancient land, it felt like a key. A directional marker, perhaps, pointing towards a deeper, more insidious truth, linking the past and the present with a terrifying precision. Doubt, a familiar serpent, coiled in my gut. Was I grasping at straws, desperate to find a pattern, to salvage a ghost from my own failures? Or was this real? The fragment of metal in my hand felt heavy, a burden and a promise. This was no mere string of heists. This was a symphony of vengeance, conducted by a maestro I thought I had buried. And I was standing on the stage again, the curtain rising on a performance I knew all too well. The wind, a dry, persistent rasp, carried the scent of sun-baked earth and distant, unseen scrub. My tires crunched over loose gravel, each stone a protest against the silence, as I navigated the winding track. The address, scrawled on a torn napkin I'd found tucked into a forgotten crevice of the warehouse, had been cryptic, a series of coordinates that pointed to nothing but emptiness on any conventional map. Yet a ghost of memory, a whisper from the files of the old case, had guided me here. A place where the desert swallowed secrets whole. The tunnel entrance, desert side, loomed, a jagged maw carved into the rock face. Rust-stained rebar jutted like broken teeth from the concrete lip, a forgotten monument to some aborted civic project. The air here was thick with the dust of ages, stirred by my arrival. No lights, no signs. Only the vast, indifferent sky overhead, bleeding the last vestiges of daylight into bruised purples and oranges. Slight hunched like a question mark etched against the dimness. It was the old contact, a man I hadn't seen in years, since the old case had dissolved into a bitter taste in my mouth. His face, when he stepped into the fading light, was a roadmap of fear and hard living. Eyes like polished stones reflecting nothing. I shouldn't have come, Cole, the old contact rasped, his voice a dry rustle like leaves skittering across pavement. He hugged himself, though the desert night had yet to truly bite. I countered, my own voice steady, a deliberate counterpoint to his tremor. I kept my hands visible, my posture open, but every nerve ending was a taut wire. The air felt heavy, charged. Or someone called for I. He swallowed, a visible effort. Things are different now, he's back, or someone like him. The words were a hurried confession, a dam breaking under pressure. The heists, I pressed, stepping closer, my boots stirring miniature dust devils. The methods, the precision, the marks. I watched his face, searching for a flicker, a recognition. The circular impression, I saw it at the vault, never just a mark, it was his signature, his claim. He used to say it meant the world, beginning and end, and no one else could ever truly understand it, only him and the ones who knew. He learned everything, the patterns, the rituals. His gaze darted past me into the deepening twilight, a prickle of unease ran down my spine, the desert was never truly empty. Who is he? I demanded, my patience fraying, the image of that perfect, unmarred circle burning behind my eyes. The apprentice, the copycat, give me a name. Before he could answer, a sudden guttural roar split the air, not human but mechanical. Headlights, brutal white daggers, erupted from the winding track I just traversed. A heavy-duty utility vehicle, dust billowing in its wake, bore down on us. My breath hitched. I had been so focused on the old contact, on the ghost of the past, that I hadn't considered the present danger. My own blindness, my desperate need for answers, had led me into an exposed position. The vehicle skidded to a halt, tires spitting gravel. They moved with a practiced, brutal efficiency. "Get down!" I yelled, shoving the old contact towards the deeper recesses of the tunnel, but he was too slow, too consumed by panic. A shot cracked, sharp and immediate, echoing off the tunnel walls. My mind reeled, no warning, no demand, just execution. I returned fire, aiming for the lead assailant, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding in the gloom. They ducked behind the vehicle, returning a volley that peppered the concrete around me, sending chips of rock stinging against my face. I pulled the old contact's limp body further into the tunnel, checking for a pulse, but his eyes were already glazing over, fixed on some unseen point. The words, "the ones who knew," echoed in my mind. The figures advanced, their movements deliberate, closing the distance. I was trapped, pinned between a dead man and a wall of concrete, the only exit blocked by armed men. My determination, once a roaring fire, flickered. Had I walked into a trap, orchestrated by the very mind I was hunting? Had I been so eager to chase the ghost that I'd forgotten the living, breathing danger? Another shot rang out, closer this time, tearing a chunk from the wall beside my head. I ducked, the smell of gunpowder acrid in my nostrils. I was outmatched, outmaneuvered. The metallic taste of failure filled my mouth. I had underestimated them. I had underestimated him. I heard the heavy footsteps, the crunch of gravel as they entered the tunnel, closing in. My escape route was sealed, my information dead. A profound sense of helplessness washed over me, a bitter reminder of the last time I'd felt this cornered, this defeated. The desert wind howled, a mournful lament for the secrets it had just claimed. The brutal white daggers of the utility vehicle's headlights tore through the twilight, carving shadows that danced like specters of dread. The old contact, his face a parchment of stark terror, let loose a desperate, choked sound, a name perhaps, or a warning I couldn't quite decipher over the engine's rising snarl. The vehicle was a beast of steel and dust, roaring down the winding track I just traversed, aimed directly at us, framed by the gaping maw of the tunnel entrance, desert side. "Get down!" I barked, my voice raw against the engine's crescendo. I shoved the old contact with a force born of adrenaline, sending him sprawling into the gritty sand beside the track. There was no time for grace, only survival. I threw myself after him, the air thick with the metallic tang of diesel and the acrid scent of scorched earth. A violent gust of wind, a precursor to the vehicle's passing, whipped my hair across my face, blinding me for a split second. The ground shuddered. It didn't slow, didn't swerve. It simply continued its relentless charge, disappearing around the bend, leaving a lingering cloud of dust and the ringing echo of its engine. It was a message, stark and brutal. "I am seen, I am known." I coughed, pushing myself up, the taste of grit on my tongue. The old contact lay gasping, clutching his ribs, a thin trickle of blood tracing a path from his temple. His eyes, wide and unfocused, stared at the retreating dust cloud. He moved the pieces. Not the first time, the second. My mind snagged on the word architect, not the killer but the one who designed. I knelt beside him, checking his pulse, the frantic beat a counterpoint to my own racing heart. "Who is the architect? What pieces? Tell me." He shuddered, a spasm of pain contorting his features. "The ledger, the old man's ledger, it has the names, the targets, not just the how, Cole, the why." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He didn't want the money, he wanted the legacy. The collection, he was just the tool. He pointed a trembling finger towards the mouth of the tunnel entrance, desert side, a faint, almost imperceptible symbol scratched into the rock face near its base. It was a glyph I recognized from the original case files, one dismissed as a random mark by the original investigators, attributed to a bored vandal or a local gang. A stylized, interlocking pair of circles, like two eyes staring into one another. My breath hitched. I had seen it on the last victim's wall, almost obscured by the chaos, a detail I had cataloged but never truly understood. "The collector," the old contact wheezed, his eyes glazing over. He wanted it all, the original, they was just clearing the way, a prelude. His hand fell limp. I felt for a pulse again, but there was only the stillness of the desert night. The old contact was gone, leaving me with a handful of fragmented words and a symbol that now burned with a new, terrifying significance. The architect, the legacy, the second time. My thoughts began to coil, tightening like a spring. The original case. The killer, a phantom of the night, had meticulously dismantled the lives of 5 prominent figures, each with an eclectic and valuable collection of antiquities. At the time, we'd focused on the method, the surgical precision, the signature left behind, the psychological profile. We'd classified it as a serial killer driven by a need for control, for spectacle. But the old contact's dying words, they twisted the narrative. He didn't want the money, he wanted the legacy, the collection. I closed my eyes, picturing the dusty files, the crime scene photos, the victims, an art dealer, a rare book collector, a numismatist, an ancient artifact enthusiast, and a curator of historical weaponry. Their collections, each unique, had been scattered, some stolen, some destroyed. We'd assumed the destruction was part of the killer's pathology. But what if it was selective destruction? What if only specific items were targeted while others were merely collateral damage? And the current heists? They mirrored the original in their cunning and precision, but the targets were different. A private archive of historical documents, a renowned geological institute's mineral display, a clandestine vault of rare botanical specimens. Not art, not antiquities, but highly specialized, irreplaceable items, the interlocking circles. I had seen them not just at the last victim's house from the original case, but also faintly, almost erased, at the scene of the first new heist. I had dismissed it as a copycat's flourish, a morbid homage. But what if it was the architect's signature, not the killer's? The pieces began to fall into place, not with a gentle click, but with the brutal force of shattering glass. The original killer was a tool, a precursor. The architect wasn't interested in the thrill of the kill or the notoriety. They were interested in what was being collected, and the current heists weren't simply mirroring the past. They were continuing it, filling in the gaps, completing a grand design. There was I grasping at straws, projecting my own failures onto a new, unrelated series of crimes. My mind reeled back to the original case, to the frustration, the dead ends. The killer's pattern, though precise, always felt incomplete, as if they were following a set of instructions rather than acting on pure impulse. But the old contact's words echoed. The second time, the architect was finishing what they started. Then the true nature of the connection snapped into focus, sharp and unforgiving. The targets of the original killer and the targets of these new heists weren't random. They weren't just valuable. They were all connected to a specific, forgotten academic project from decades ago. A grand, ambitious, and ultimately failed endeavor to catalog and preserve a unique regional history, spearheaded by a consortium of scholars, collectors, and institutions. My father, a history professor, had been part of that consortium, an idealistic, driven man who dedicated years to it before it collapsed under the weight of political infighting and funding cuts. The architect, the collector, not of money, not of fame, but of a legacy. Someone who saw the original project's failure as a personal affront, who believed these items, these fragments of history, rightfully belonged together under their control. Someone who had the means, the intellect, and the ruthless patience to orchestrate decades of planning and coal. My father's son, the disgraced detective who had failed to see the true pattern, the underlying motive all those years ago. The architect wasn't just completing a collection. They were mocking my past failure, taunting me with the very blind spots that had haunted me for years. They knew I would recognize the method. They wanted me to see the pattern, to understand the true purpose behind the original killer's rampage. And now, they were ensuring I couldn't stop them from completing it. The game had always been personal, I just hadn't known it until now. The architect was playing with me, and I was their final, reluctant piece on the board. The dust of forgotten files still clung to my mind, a fine grit irritating the edges of my thoughts. We'd assumed the chaos was random, a byproduct of the hunt, a smokescreen. I had assumed too much. A single, stark image had appeared on my burner phone, an anonymous whisper in the digital void. It was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable, the gaping maw of the tunnel entrance, desert side. No message, no instruction, just the desolate image, a silent summons. My instincts, frayed but still sharp, screamed at the urgency. This wasn't a taunt for the general public. This was a personal invitation. The old pickup truck chewed through the miles of sun-baked asphalt, kicking up plumes of ruddy earth that momentarily obscured the rear view. The air conditioner, wheezing its last, did little to combat the oppressive heat that pressed down like a physical weight. As I veered off the paved road onto a track barely wider than the truck itself, the landscape shifted. Cacti, gnarled and defiant, stood sentinel against a sky that bled from pale azure to a searing white at the horizon. The silence of the desert was profound, broken only by the crunch of tires on gravel and the frantic thrum of my own pulse. It wasn't a natural formation, but a relic, a testament to some forgotten ambition, its concrete rim cracked and crumbling like old teeth. The air here was still, heavy with the scent of dry earth and something else, a faint metallic tang that prickled at the back of my throat. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, grip tight. Stepping out, my boots crunched on loose stones. The tunnel entrance was wider than I'd anticipated, a yawning blackness that promised only deeper mysteries. The photo hadn't shown the meticulous arrangement at its mouth. There, centered on a patch of sun-baked earth, was a small, ornate pedestal. It was fashioned from rusted rebar and jagged shards of concrete, a crude altar against the vastness. And upon it, bathed in the unforgiving desert light, sat an object that froze the blood in my veins. It was a coin. Not just any coin, but an ancient tetradrachm, its silver surface gleaming with an impossible, almost unnatural brilliance. I knew this coin. I knew its weight, its specific imperfection where the die had slipped, the stern profile of Athena on one side, the owl on the other. It had been part of the numismatist's collection, a piece believed lost forever, swallowed by the chaos of that terrible night years ago. I had kept it not as a trophy, but as a burden, a tangible reminder of a case that had slipped through my fingers, an item deemed insignificant by the official report, but profoundly significant to me. I had buried it deep within my own dwelling, a secret shame. Now it lay before me, polished to an impossible sheen, the centuries of grime scoured away. But it wasn't just cleaned. This wasn't just a taunt. It was a violation, a surgical strike aimed directly at the heart of my deepest failure. The perpetrator knew about the coin, knew I had kept it, knew the gnawing guilt it represented. They had found it, retrieved it from my supposedly secure hiding place, and brought it here to this desolate stage to deliver their message. How? How had they known about the coin, its secret resting place? Only a handful of people had ever even been near my dwelling. Fewer still knew of my private, self-imposed penance. The implications were a venomous coil tightening around my resolve. This wasn't just about the heists anymore. It was about me. My past, my secrets, my very soul laid bare. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the ancient silver. The engraving, so stark and clean, mocked me. I missed the mark. It was true, I had. I had missed the mark with the numismatist, with all the victims, and now the ghost of my failure had been resurrected, polished, and thrown back in my face. The perpetrator wasn't just mirroring the past, they were rewriting it, ensuring that this time, I would be a part of the collection. The sun beat down, turning the desert air into a shimmering mirage. My eyes scanned the desolate expanse, searching for any sign, any movement, but there was nothing. This wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. This was about survival, about confronting the very demons I thought I had locked away. The game had changed. The stakes had been raised, higher than any collection, any treasure. They had targeted me, and in doing so, they had given me the one thing I needed most, absolute, unyielding clarity. This was war, and I would not miss the mark again. The desert wind, a sculptor of the land, had honed its edge against my resolve. I stood at the tunnel entrance, desert side, a maw carved into the sun-baked rock, its darkness promising more than just shade. The cold wave from the previous encounter, the perpetrator's intimate knowledge of my deepest scar, had solidified into a granite core of determination within me. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a reckoning. My boots crunched on loose gravel, each step a deliberate intrusion upon the stillness. The tunnel, a black pupil in the vast, ochre eye of the desert, stretched into an unknown depth. I had studied the schematics, the grainy satellite images, the geological surveys. This was an old mining access, abandoned decades ago, its existence a forgotten whisper in the annals of local history. I unwound the fine filament, almost invisible against the sandy earth, anchoring it to a jagged outcropping. The perpetrator, I believed, was a creature of habit, of meticulous observation. They wouldn't rush. They would scout, they would wait, they would observe me. And that was the pivot of my strategy. I moved with the deliberate grace of a predator, each movement economical, each placement precise. The sun, a molten coin, began its slow descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. I placed the small, thermal-activated camera near a cluster of saguaros, its lens angled to capture the tunnel's entrance without betraying its presence. Its power cell, humming faintly, was good for days. A shard of doubt pricked at me then, a momentary sliver of ice in my resolve. Was I truly seeing through their eyes, or merely projecting my own broken reflections onto their grand design? The thought was a fleeting ghost, quickly banished. I had walked this path before, stumbled, fallen. But this time I carried the weight of that failure as a shield, not a burden. The bait was next, not a physical object, but an illusion. I arranged a small, seemingly haphazard pile of discarded equipment near the tunnel's mouth. A rusted pickaxe, a coil of frayed rope, a half-buried lantern. It mimicked the careless detritus of a hasty exploration, a feigned interest in the tunnel's forgotten depths. This was the lure. The perpetrator had an affinity for the theatrical, for symbols of transgression and discovery. This subtle invitation, I hoped, would be irresistible. They would approach, they would investigate, drawn by the perceived opportunity to observe an amateur's fumbling. And in that moment, my hidden sensors would sing. Hours crawled, marked by the deepening purple of the sky and the sharp descent of the desert's temperature. I hunkered down behind a ridge, telescope pressed to my eye, scanning the vast expanse. My breathing was shallow, my senses heightened. Every rustle of dry brush, every shift of sand was amplified into a potential signal. My focus was absolute, a single unwavering beam. Then, through the lens, a flicker, a glint of something metallic far off, near the horizon line where the desert met the distant, jagged mountains. It was too fleeting to be certain, too distant to be anything but a trick of light. But a tremor, a low thrum of anticipation ran through me. Had they already arrived? Were they watching me? I shifted my gaze, sweeping the ridge lines, the valleys, searching for any anomaly. Nothing. Perhaps it had been a mirage, a cruel jest of the fading light. I allowed myself a slow, controlled exhale, trying to steady the frantic drumbeat in my chest. This was the game, the agonizing wait. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a sudden, profound twilight, I made a final check of my equipment. The miniature drone, tucked away in its compartment, was fully charged, its quiet rotors ready. I armed the sensor grid. Then a discovery, subtle and jarring, interrupted my precise movements. Near a cluster of dried desert flowers, partially obscured by a fallen rock, I noticed a patch of disturbed earth. Not a footprint, not a drag mark, but something else. A shallow depression, almost perfectly circular, about the size of a small dinner plate. It was too regular to be natural, too distinct to be casual. It looked like a recent impression, as if something heavy with a perfectly flat, circular base had rested there for a short time. I knelt, brushing away the loose sand. There was a faint sheen to the compressed earth, almost microscopic, like a residue. It wasn't oil, nor metal dust. It had a faint, almost sweet chemical scent, barely perceptible against the sharp tang of the desert. This didn't fit. The perpetrator's methods, as I understood them, were about precision, stealth, and a complete lack of residue. They left no trace, no signature beyond the macabre artistry of their crimes. This impression, this faint scent, was a lapse, a careless oversight, or it was something I hadn't accounted for. My breath hitched. Why would someone so meticulous leave this? Unless it wasn't a mistake, unless it was a different kind of signature. A signature that hinted not at a lone operator, but at specialized equipment. Equipment that wasn't designed for stealth, but for something heavier, more industrial. The perpetrator was meticulous, yes, but this was too meticulous in a way that contradicted the previous lack of evidence. It was a wait. That doesn't add up moment that sent a shiver down my spine, not of fear, but of profound unease. It wasn't just a serial killer I was hunting. It was something more complex, something with resources I hadn't dared to imagine. The trap, I realized, might be far more intricate than I had conceived. And I, standing alone in the vast, unforgiving desert, might be more vulnerable than I knew. The cold wave from the previous encounter, the perpetrator's intimate knowledge of my deepest fissures, still clung to me like desert dust after a storm. This was not merely a path, but a passage into the labyrinth of my own making, where past and present converged in a breathless chokehold. The air inside was thick, stagnant, carrying the metallic tang of old earth and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness I couldn't quite place. My flashlight beam, a pale sword against the absolute black, cut through the gloom, illuminating damp rock walls that wept slow, glistening tears. I moved with the caution of a cat on broken glass, every nerve strung taut. The tunnel narrowed, then opened into a vast, cavernous space, a natural amphitheater carved by ancient forces or perhaps by patient, deliberate hands. And there at its heart a figure stood. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a conversation, a final, brutal reckoning. "Cole," the voice echoed, low and resonant, yet strangely devoid of emotion. It was the same voice from the phone calls, the one that had twisted the knife in my old wounds. I always were one for the dramatic entrance, right on cue. My breath hitched. I knew I'd come. Of course. The figure shifted, and for the first time I saw details. Not a mask, but a hood deep set, obscuring the face, yet allowing the glint of eyes to pierce through. A long coat, the fabric heavy, almost ceremonial. I can't resist a puzzle. Can I? My gut twisted. This was more than mimicry, it was an obsession. "What do you want?" I inquired, my voice rough, strained. The perpetrator chuckled, a dry, rustling sound that scraped against my nerves. I want you to see Cole, to truly see the patterns you missed, the faces you forgot. Why this way?" "The heists are merely the brushstrokes," the figure said, stepping closer, the movement fluid, predatory. "The canvas is much larger. It's about legacy, Cole, about correcting a narrative. You remember the last one, don't you? The one that broke you." My fingers tightened around my weapon. The heists mirrored the serial killer I failed to catch years ago. The last one, the words were a direct assault. The bank job, the vault. Precisely, and the little girl tucked away in the manager's office. You found her, didn't you? After the fact. How could this person know such intimate, painful details? Details that had been buried deep, rotting in the confines of my own memory. Who are I? The figure stopped just beyond the reach of the table. Someone who understood the art, someone who saw the truth behind the chaos, the other truth. A sudden, sharp movement, a fleeting glimpse of something metallic, a glint of steel. My mind screamed, trap. I lunged, not at the figure, but sideways, rolling behind a massive rock formation just as a shot rang out, echoing deafeningly in the cavern. The bullet ricocheted, whining off the rock face, sending a shower of sparks. Clever, the perpetrator's voice drifted, now edged with a cruel amusement. Always the strategist, Cole, but rusty and outnumbered. Outnumbered from a sudden, sickening realization. The details, the intimate knowledge, the way the heists were planned, the meticulous nature. It wasn't just one mind. It was a partnership, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't the master planner, not the voice of torment. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. The inconsistencies, the moments where the perpetrator's actions seemed to diverge, the subtle shifts in method. The hooded figure remained still, allowing the second to advance. Brilliant, Cole, took I long enough, always chasing the ghost, never seeing the flesh and blood right in front of I. The second figure, closer now, stepped into the sickly light, and that's when I saw it. A faint, almost faded tattoo. A small, stylized bird caught mid-flight. My world tilted. No, I breathed, the word torn from my throat. It was the same tattoo I'd seen years ago on the arm of a young man, a witness from that very same bank heist, the one I had interviewed, the one I had dismissed as a traumatized bystander. A boy who had vanished shortly after, written off as a runaway. Yes, Cole, the hooded figure said, stepping forward, shedding the heavy coat, revealing a form that was undeniably female, the one you left behind. It wasn't a man mimicking the killer. It was a woman and the young man, the witness, her brother. My past failure wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about protecting the innocent. And I had failed them both. The heists weren't just a mirror. They were a meticulously crafted revenge, a public dissection of my inability to see the truth, to protect the vulnerable. The perpetrator's intimate knowledge of my deepest fissures wasn't just from observation. It was from a direct, painful, personal connection. The betrayal, the deep-seated anger was not just about the killer, but about me. You let him get away. The woman's voice was low, trembling with a controlled rage, and you let us suffer the consequences. The young man, her brother, raised his pistol. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight for survival, against the ghosts of my own making, against the very victims I had failed to save. And they were here to finish what I had started, what I had left undone. The cavern, once a silent tomb, now thrummed with the unbearable weight of a history that refused to stay buried. The metallic glint of the pistol barrel was a cold star in the gloom, reflecting the last sliver of the desert's dying light. It pointed, unwavering, at my chest. The young man's face, etched with a grief so profound it twisted his features into a mask of fury, held no flicker of hesitation. This wasn't a bluff. This was the raw, unpolished edge of a broken heart honed into a weapon. You left us, he rasped, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to absorb the very air around us. You left her. His sister stood a step behind him. Her eyes, though filled with tears, held the same stark resolve. They were the ghosts I had failed to save, now corporeal and armed, standing at the precipice of my own judgment. The cavern, once a sanctuary of secrets, now felt like a mausoleum. He scoffed, a bitter, broken sound. Sorry won't bring her back. Sorry won't fix what you broke. He took a step forward, the pistol still steady. My gaze flickered past him to the tunnel entrance, desert side, where the last vestiges of twilight bled into the vast expanse of the night sky. The wind, a mournful sigh, stirred the sand at our feet. There was no escape, not really, not from them, not from myself. What do you want? I questioned, my voice steady despite the tremor in my gut. Justice, the sister interjected, her voice clearer, sharper. The justice you denied us, the justice you denied her. It was then, in the stark clarity of their accusation, that a piece clicked into place. Not just their grief, but the intricate dance of the heists, the echoes of the past. It wasn't merely revenge for their sister. It was a performance, a meticulously crafted drama designed to ensnare me, to make me witness their pain, to make me understand. But who was the true director? The meticulousness, the precision. It's not just about avenging my sister, is it? Someone else taught I how to do this. Someone who knew the details of my failures, of his methods. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or a hint of fear crossed the young man's face before he clamped down on it. The sister's gaze darted to her brother, then back to me, a subtle hesitation in her stance. It was a tell, a tiny crack in their united front. I read wrong, the young man snarled, but the conviction in his voice wavered like a poorly struck bell. Am I? I pressed, pushing my advantage, my mind racing. The specific details, the timing, the message, it's too precise. I was used, both of I. It was a sound like rustling parchment, ancient and malevolent. Both the young man and his sister stiffened, turning their heads. Then a figure emerged from the gloom, stepping into the faint light that filtered from the desert beyond. He was gaunt, his face a roadmap of lines, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He wore a heavy, dust-caked coat that seemed to absorb what little light there was. I knew him, or rather, I knew the legend of him, the one the precinct had dismissed as an urban myth. The unseen hand, the puppet master, the true partner. Clever, Cole, the stranger rasped, his voice like grinding stones. Even after all these years, your mind still finds the threads. A pity you couldn't find them when it mattered most. Reveal/discovery, this was the true ghost. Not a victim, but a survivor of the original killer's circle. He had been there all along, lurking in the periphery, watching, learning, waiting for the perfect moment to resurface. He was the one who had meticulously recreated the old killer's work, not out of mimicry, but out of a perverse sense of legacy. He had found these grieving siblings, cultivated their rage, and weaponized their pain. He hadn't just used them, he had groomed them. You, I breathed, the name catching in my throat, unspoken but understood. The one they called the archivist in the hushed, unofficial reports. The collector of pain, the curator of suffering. Indeed, the archivist said, a predatory smile stretching his thin lips. He held nothing in his hands, yet his presence was more menacing than any firearm. The original masterpiece was incomplete, and the artist prematurely retired. I merely sought to finish his work. He looked from the archivist to me, a sudden horror in his eyes. The sister, too, seemed to shrink, her earlier conviction dissolving into doubt. They hadn't been seeking justice. They had been performing a ritual for a madman. Event. Suddenly, a beam of harsh, white light sliced through the desert night, cutting across the tunnel entrance. It seemed he had understood. The archivist's eyes, which moments before had held the gleam of triumph, now narrowed into slits of pure venom. Interference, he hissed, a guttural sound of displeasure. He didn't turn to flee, not immediately. Instead, his gaze locked onto the young man, a silent, terrible command passing between them. The young man, caught between his manipulated fury and the terrifying reality of his puppet master, hesitated. His pistol, still pointed at me, trembled. Completion, the final act. But the spell was broken. The approaching lights, the blare of the sirens, shattered the intimate theater of our confrontation. The young man's eyes, once burning with righteous anger, now held only confusion and fear. Desert sighed. He used us, the sister cried, pulling at her brother's arm. He used our pain. The young man's pistol dropped, clattering loudly on the rocky ground. The sound was deafening, a final punctuation mark to the long, torturous sentence of this case. He stood frozen, his face a mask of betrayal and despair. The archivist, seeing his pawns falter, vanished into the deeper recesses of the tunnel, a phantom slipping away into the earth. I didn't pursue him, not yet. My eyes were on the young man and his sister, their faces illuminated now by the approaching police lights. They were victims, too, in a way. Victims of a different kind of monster and of my own past failings. The weight of that realization settled upon me heavy but clearer. As the first uniformed figures emerged from the desert haze, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, I raised my hands slowly. The case was resolved in its own twisted way. But the ghosts of my making, the ones I had truly failed, still stood before me, their faces etched with a pain that would haunt me long after the sirens faded. This wasn't the end of my journey, only a different kind of beginning. A beginning where I would finally have to confront not just the monsters of the world, but the ones I carried within.